This video is about one thing, and I want to say it plainly before anything else. There are people who came to your neighborhood this year and knocked on a door they had already decided to knock on before they got out of the truck. Not because of storm damage, not because of anything you did, because of who you are now and where you are now and what you own. I want to tell you about the 11 minutes I stood at my own front door listening to a man with a clipboard. I had been retired for 3 weeks. I had nowhere to be. And by the time he left, he knew more about my house, my roof timeline, and my level of concern than he had any business knowing. I didn't hire him. But I want you to understand what happened in those 11 minutes, because it took me much longer than I expected to understand it myself. My name is Linda Calloway. I spent 27 years in human resources, the last 9 as HR director for a hospital system. And I carried the weight of what I am about to tell you for months before I was ready to say it out loud. If this channel is a conversation you want to keep having, subscribe. Not as a reflex, as a decision to keep paying attention to this stage of life. Hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next. Before we go any further, are you watching this retired, or are you still on the other side of the door? Write it in the comments. I want to know who is in this room. What I discovered is that the knock at the door wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the middle. And in 15 minutes, you'll understand exactly why I opened with that. Nobody told me that the week I retired, I would become a more attractive target, not for investment fraud. Not for the scams you read about in magazines. For the man who knocked on my front door on a Tuesday afternoon, stood on my porch with a clipboard and a friendly expression, and told me my roof was showing serious wear that I really ought to have looked at before the next storm season. I was 3 weeks into retirement. I had nowhere to be. I had a house I'd owned for 30 years and taken care of for all of them. And I stood there at my own front door in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon that I still hadn't quite figured out what to do with, and I listened to him for 11 minutes. I didn't hire him, I want to be clear about that, but I listened longer than I should have. I answered his questions. I told him when the roof had last been replaced. I mentioned, without thinking, that we'd had some shingles repaired after a storm 2 summers back. And when he left with more information about my house, my timeline, and my level of concern than he had any business having. I stood in the doorway after he was gone and thought, that was not a random knock. It wasn't. That is the thing I want to talk about today, because it took me longer than it should have to understand it fully. There are people who knock on doors in neighborhoods like mine in the middle of Tuesday afternoons, specifically because they know who answers those doors now. They know who is home. They know who owns their house free and clear, or close to it. They know who has spent decades maintaining something they're proud of, and who, now that they're home all day, is primed to worry about it. I was not a random door. I was a profile, and I had just handed myself to it. How many of you have had that knock? How many of you have stood at the door and thought, well, he seems to know what he's talking about? How many of you have let someone onto your property, onto your roof, because the urgency felt real and the expertise seemed credible, and there was nobody standing next to you saying, wait a minute, think this through? And here is what I want to ask you, because I think this is the question underneath the question. How many of you felt afterward a version of what I felt? Not quite embarrassed, not quite angry, something closer to unsettled, the feeling of having been read, of having had someone look at you and see exactly the opening you didn't know you were presenting. Because that is the part nobody talks about. We talk about the scam, we talk about the dollar amounts and the fake estimates and the work that never needed to be done. What we don't talk about is the specific reason this happens more to people in this stage of life than at any other stage. And it is not because we are less intelligent. It is not because we are less capable. It is because retirement creates a set of specific, real, undernamed conditions that people with bad intentions have learned to find and use. That is worth understanding, not so we can be afraid, so we can stop being surprised when it happens and start being prepared before it does. I spent 27 years in human resources, the last 9 as HR director for a healthcare system with 4 hospitals and roughly 3,200 employees. In that work, I spent a great deal of time thinking about organizational vulnerability, where systems have gaps, where people are exposed, where the conditions that seem protective can actually create openings. I understood that structurally. I understood it in other people's organizations. And then I retired, and I stood in my own doorway for 11 minutes, and I understood that I had not applied any of that thinking to myself. That is either ironic or humbling, probably both. What I'm about to share took me a while to piece together, some of it from my own experience, some of it from women I know who went through versions of this that went much further than mine. Once I saw the full picture, I could not look at that Tuesday afternoon door knock the same way, and you won't either. The first thing to understand is what I think of as the infrastructure disappearance. And I don't mean financial infrastructure. I mean the informal, invisible web of professional contexts that surrounded you for your entire career and that you probably never thought of as protection because it was just the water you swam in. In your working life, if you needed a contractor, you asked someone. You asked a colleague whose husband had just had their kitchen redone. You asked the office manager who seemed to know everyone. You asked someone in your professional network who had recently dealt with exactly this issue. You had access, without even trying, to a constant stream of vetted information about local businesses, reliable tradespeople, people to avoid. You didn't have to work for that. It was just there, as a function of being embedded in an organization and a professional community. And then you retired. It happens gradually enough that you don't feel it go. But 6 months in, a year in, you start to realize that the informal network has thinned. The colleagues you would have asked are still at work. The conversations that used to happen naturally in conference rooms and hallways and parking lots are no longer happening. You are home. You are managing your own house. And the decisions that used to be distributed across a dozen relationships are now sitting entirely with you, made largely alone, without the background noise of professional community that used to do half your vetting without you even noticing it was happening. That is not weakness. That is a structural change, and it creates a real opening that did not exist in the same way when you were working. There is also something else, and this one is harder to name without it sounding like a criticism, because it is not. It is simply an observation about what the transition does. When you are working, your calendar is full. Your attention is divided. You are managing multiple priorities simultaneously, and there is a certain skepticism that comes with that, the hurried professional mind that says, "I don't have time for this. What do you actually want? Get to the point." That skepticism is not always a virtue, but it is a filter. It keeps certain things out. When you are newly retired, particularly in the first year, the calendar opens. You are home. You have time. And time, real, unscheduled time, makes you more conversational, more present, more willing to stand on your own porch and listen to what someone is saying, because you are no longer calculating what meeting you're missing while they talk. That openness is one of the genuinely good things about this stage of life. The person who learns to exploit it has simply found the other side of something real. I want to tell you about a woman I know. Her name is Renata. She retired about 18 months before I did, after 30 years as a hospital administrator. Smart, careful, experienced with contracts and vendors and institutional decision-making in ways that most people never get to be. She told me about a crew that came to her neighborhood the week after a significant hailstorm. They were going door to door. They had photographs, real photographs of real hail damage on roofs in her area. They had a truck with a company name on it. They had a man who climbed onto her roof while she stood in her yard and who came down 20 minutes later with a written estimate for $4,200 in repairs. Renata is not a person who makes impulsive decisions. She asked questions. He had answers for every one of them. She asked to see his license. He had a paper that looked like a license. She asked how long the company had been in business. He told her 6 years. She asked for references. He gave her 2 phone numbers. What she did not do, and she told me this herself without any attempt to soften it, is call those numbers before she signed the estimate. She called them 2 days later, after the check had been cashed, and the crew had done work she later had evaluated by a second contractor who told her that perhaps a third of what was charged was actually necessary. She sat with me in my kitchen and said, "I have reviewed hundreds of vendor contracts. I negotiated service agreements for a 4-hospital system. I have absolutely no idea how that happened. I knew how it happened, I just didn't say so in that moment, because what she needed then was not an analysis. But I have thought about it since." What happened to Renata was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of context. She was operating outside the institutional framework that had always backstopped her professional decisions. She was alone at her own house on a weekday afternoon. She was the only decision-maker in the room. And the person in front of her had done this before, many times, with people exactly like her, and had calibrated every element of the interaction to move faster than her natural caution could work. That is what these operations understand. They understand that the window of effective hesitation is short, that if they can manufacture enough urgency, storm damage, limited availability, a price that is only good today, they can compress the time between first contact and signed agreement to less than an hour, less than 45 minutes, less than the amount of time it takes a careful person to make a few calls. And what I took from Renata's story was this: the goal is not to be faster than the urgency. The goal is to refuse to live inside someone else's timeline entirely. There is a specific decision I made after that conversation with Renata and after my own 11 minutes on the porch. I decided that no one who comes to my door unsolicited about anything involving my house will ever get a same-day decision from me. Not because I am suspicious of everyone, not because I think every person with a ladder is running a scheme, but because that is my timeline, and anyone who needs me to decide faster than that is telling me something important about their operation without meaning to. That decision has cost me nothing. It has already saved me, at minimum, the discomfort of several conversations that were moving in a direction I didn't want them to go. I want to tell you about something that happened about 8 months into my retirement, because it shows a different version of this that I think is worth naming, and because it taught me something about the practice that I want to hand to you directly. It was a Saturday morning in October. Tom had gone out early. I was at the kitchen table with coffee and a book I had been meaning to get to since June, and the house was quiet in the way that I had finally, by month 8, started to actually enjoy rather than resist. The light was good. I had nowhere to be. I was, for the first time in my adult life, fully inside a Saturday morning in a way that felt earned. Then a truck pulled up. A man got out, late 30s, work clothes, unhurried, and knocked on the door, politely. No urgency in his posture, no clipboard already in hand, nothing theatrical about the approach. He introduced himself, mentioned a street 2 blocks over where his crew was finishing a job, and said that on his way past our house, he had noticed what looked like some gutter separation from the fascia on the east side. He said he figured I'd want to know. He said he wasn't there to sell me anything. He said if I wanted, since he had the ladder on the truck already, he was happy to take a look at no charge and tell me what he saw. I want to be honest about what I felt standing there. I felt the pull of it. Not the pressure, there was no pressure, just the pull. The reasonableness of the offer. The fact that I had in fact been meaning to have someone look at the gutters since the previous spring. The fact that here was someone with the exact skill I needed standing at my door on a morning when I had no other plans. Everything about his manner was reasonable. He was not rushed. He did not create a window of time that was closing. He did not mention a storm. He seemed, for all the world, like a neighbor who happened to be in the trade and was doing someone a courtesy. I thanked him. I told him I appreciated him stopping. And I told him that I had a contractor I worked with regularly and that I would have him take a look on his next visit, and if there was something that needed addressing, I would reach back out. He nodded, said that was fair, left his card on the porch railing, walked back to the truck, and drove away. I stood in the doorway for a moment after he left, and I thought, I genuinely do not know which kind of person that was. That is the thing I want you to sit with. I do not know to this day whether that man's gutter story was accurate. I do not know whether he was running a legitimate small operation or whether he was a skilled version of the same game in a less obvious costume. I genuinely cannot tell you. And that is exactly the point. The right response to the unsolicited door knock does not require you to correctly diagnose whether the person is trustworthy. That is a test you are unlikely to pass reliably because you do not have enough information, and the people who do this for a living have spent time making themselves look like the legitimate version. The right response is a practice. The same words, the same pause, the same answer. Every time, regardless of how the person presents. Not because everyone who knocks on your door is running a scheme, because the cost of that one conversation is nothing compared to the cost of the one you said yes to when you should have waited. I was not rude to that man. I did not accuse him of anything. I simply declined to enter the frame he was offering and returned to the kitchen table and the book I had been meaning to read since June. That is the whole of the practice. One sentence, said calmly, and then the door closes and the morning is yours again. The 3 questions I keep ready, and I keep them in my phone now, not because I need to read from them, but because having them written down means I am never improvising under mild pressure, are these. Are you licensed and insured in this state, and can I see the documentation before we continue? Can you give me the names of 2 people in this neighborhood who have used you in the last year, with numbers I can call today? And, is this something I can take 24 hours to think about, or are you telling me the decision needs to be made right now? That 3rd question is the one that does the most work. Anyone who tells you the decision has to be made today is giving you important information about their operation. Urgency that belongs to them is not urgency that belongs to you. And the moment you name that distinction out loud, you have already moved outside the frame they built. Now, here's the thing I want to spend a moment on, because I think it is the thing that actually keeps people from talking about this. When someone gets taken, When Renata signs the estimate and the check cashes and she is standing in her kitchen looking at the amount and thinking, "I should have known better." What happens next is almost as damaging as the original event. What happens is silence. She did not tell her daughter for 4 months. 4 months of sitting with it. 4 months of her daughter calling to chat and Renata managing the conversation so the subject didn't come up. 4 months of a woman who had spent 30 years making consequential decisions for a large institution, carrying something she had decided was too embarrassing to say out loud. I understand this completely. I would likely have done the same thing, and I want to name why because I think the reason matters. There is a version of our professional identity that says, "I am the competent one. I am the one who handles things. I am the one people come to when they need it done right." And when something happens that seems to contradict that, when we're the one who got played instead of the one who caught the play, it touches something deeper than embarrassment. It touches the story we have been telling ourselves and others for decades about who we are. And the shame of that is part of the design. I do not mean that cynically. I mean it literally. The people who run these operations understand that their customers, if we want to call them that, are unlikely to report them, are unlikely to tell their neighbors, are unlikely to post a review or make a call to a licensing board. Not because they are passive or incapable, because the transaction was engineered to produce shame on one side and therefore silence on the other. And silence is the best protection a fraudulent contractor can have. Think about what would have happened if Renata had told her daughter the week it happened. Her daughter would have told her neighbor. Her neighbor would have told someone at her office. The story would have moved through a community that lives in neighborhoods exactly like Renata's and shops at the same hardware stores and has the same conversations over backyard fences. The crew that came through after that hailstorm would have found several more doors that didn't open as easily. Silence protects the operation. The most protective thing Renata eventually did was tell me. Not because I could do anything about what had already happened, but because I told 3 other people. And those 3 people are now the kind of people who hear an unsolicited knock and remember a name and a truck and a description of a practice. Being targeted is not a verdict on who you are. That is what I want you to hear, not as comfort, as fact. You own a home. You are home during the day. You have equity in that home and pride in it, and 30 years of maintenance decisions behind you. Those are not weaknesses. Those are not marks of diminishment. They are marks of a life built well. And someone looking for an opening saw those marks and came to your door. That is a statement about them, about their operation, about the specific, calculated targeting of a demographic that they have identified as high value and reachable. It is not a statement about your intelligence or your capability or your fitness to manage your own affairs. Simple, but not easy to hold on to when you are standing in your kitchen the day after. Being targeted is not a verdict. It is a situation. And situations you can prepare for. What I have come to understand 3 years into this is that protecting myself in retirement is not the same project as protecting myself at 52. The landscape is different. The infrastructure I used to rely on is different. The conditions that create openings are different. And the way I move through that landscape has to be different too. Not because I am less capable, but because the terrain changed when I left the office and I need a current map, not the one I was using before. That is the updating I keep coming back to. Not a diminishment of what I know, an honest reckoning with what has changed around me and a decision to see it clearly. Here is what I want to leave you with. 6 months from now, when someone knocks on your door with a ladder and a sense of urgency, you are going to remember something from today. Not everything, something. And that something, whatever it is that stays, is going to slow the clock. It is going to put one beat of space between their timeline and your answer. And in that beat, you are going to find your own ground. Because here is what I have learned. The scam depends on speed. It depends on compression. It depends on you making a decision inside a window that they have engineered and you have not had time to examine. The moment you step outside that window, politely, calmly, without accusation, the operation falls apart. Not because you have outsmarted anyone, because you have simply refused to live inside a frame that someone else built for you. That is the practice. One breath, one phrase. I will need to think about this, and I will be in touch if I decide to move forward. That is the whole of it, and you are entirely capable of it. I want to ask you something before you go, and I would genuinely like to know the answer. Has something like this happened to you? Not necessarily a contractor, any version of this. A situation where you felt the pressure of someone else's timeline and made a decision you later sat with, or almost made one and caught yourself just in time. Or watched it happen to someone you love and felt the helplessness of seeing it from the outside. Write it in the comments, not because you need to confess anything, because the person who reads your story next week might be sitting where you were sitting before it happened. And your 2 sentences might be the thing that slows their clock. I read the comments, all of them, and the ones that stop me are almost never the ones with the most dramatic stories. They are the ones that say, "I thought it was just me." Those are the ones I write back to, because they are never just them. If what you heard today felt true to something you have been navigating, I would be glad to have you subscribe. Not as a transaction, because the conversations that happen here have become some of the most honest ones I have, and I would like you to be part of them. Hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next. Take care of your house. It is worth protecting. So are you.